Oh, you have to unmute.
Yeah, Paul, unmute, and then you've got screen share on. I can see you talking, Paul, but we're not hearing you because you're muted.
There you are.
There I am. All right.
Okay.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My apologies for the slowness to get the unmute to work. I did want to begin by showing you pictures of Zealand Alexander Kai Butler. And there he is with his mother, my granddaughter, Nisa. And there he's got the best foot forward. And clearly we have to have him with his grandpa here. This is his dad, Seth, and his great grandpa. First time for great grandpa and great grandma to be recognized as great. And probably one of the greatest things we've done has been to have good kids. It is my pleasure this evening to welcome you all to a session that will be presented by Jonathan Neville. And he's been with us 2 or 3 times previously, and his presentations have been well attended with good questions following, and I anticipate the same this evening. This time he is focused upon infinite goodness. That is the book he recently has put out that that really strikes me as being the best of his masterpieces, and I think I've been through over 20 of his books. He has examined the words that belong in the Book of Mormon, in the Bible, in the texts of Jonathan Edwards, and finds that while yes, Joseph Smith clearly used biblical references extensively, he also used references from Jonathan Edwards very frequently. And one of those was the concept of infinite goodness. I had not been aware that infinite goodness was not a biblical phrase, but I did look it up in Strong's Concordance, and it only shows up 3 times. And that's infinite shows up 3 times. Goodness, of course, shows up a lot more. But the concept of infinite goodness is used 11 times in the Book of Mormon. It's used 55 times by Jonathan Edwards with essentially the same meanings. And so to tie this back to his earlier presentation on a man that can translate, then we're getting a more complete picture of the process through which God prepared the Book of Mormon for our edification. And so I anticipate you'll join me this evening in what I anticipate will be a most enjoyable expansion of our perceptions, because I think most of us have not appreciated what he is going to be able to show us in terms of these connections between Jonathan Edwards, the 1700s theologian who dominated American religious thought for the First Awakening, and then Joseph Smith, whose influence in the Second Awakening is so profoundly influential. So let us pray. Infinite goodness, Creator, Father, and friend, we bow before you in awe, understanding that with you there is no beginning nor end. Yet for us, confined by time, by dimensions beyond our ability to see, the awesome nature of what and who you are becomes evident as we see your hand in our history. For you spoke the word and light penetrated the darkness. You spoke the word and creatures found their caves their lairs and nests. You spoke the word, and the universe became whole. And you spoke the word, and man became a living soul. This evening, we gather to explore the origins of phrases of the Book of Mormon on a new level, led by our presenter, the erudite author, Jonathan Neville. And we ask for him your blessing that we communicate the good news that your word is yours. Ours is constrained by more limited views. And somehow through the mist, we apprehend that your views can become ours, and we embrace you, allow you to open our eyes and hearts to your loving eternal powers. And we want to expand our thinking, our understanding of your will. So we gather here to listen, to absorb, to discuss, our intellect to fulfill. And we recognize your infinite goodness that has brought us here together for our thinking to ascend to a higher plane than we have found, where we can embrace you as Creator God and friend. Amen.
Amen.
All right, I stopped the screen sharing and we can turn over to Jonathan Neville. I do want to express my gratitude to all of those of you who did us the kindness, because for the previous month, for our family, Rena's family in particular, to have had 12 deaths in a month has been an excruciating experience. But then to have this beautiful great grandson show up the day after the last of those funerals has been a beautiful experience. And so life goes on and we're going with it. Thank you for this prayerful support that so many of you have offered, and may the world be blessed as we face a new generation. Jonathan, I am fascinated with your book, anxious to ask some questions, but first of all, let's give you the chance to present.
Okay. Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you again for all you do to put this together. It's just amazing. It's been very rewarding for me, and I'm sure for everyone participating here. I've been particularly enthusiastic about this book. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen here because it really has opened the Book of Mormon to me in a new way. And one of the things I like to compare it to is when we read the Book of Mormon and it refers to the law of Moses. If we didn't have the Bible, no one would know what the law of Moses is, right? And so the Book of Mormon kind of has these shortcuts, let's say, that allude to the Bible, but you have to know the Bible to understand the shortcut. And that's kind of what I found now with Jonathan Edwards in here, as I'll explain. But it just opens the text up to a whole new level of understanding and appreciation. But even maybe more importantly, it puts it squarely within the Christian tradition, which is really exciting. This is the cover. I guess I should explain the cover a little bit. This is a feature on the coast of Oregon, not far from where we live, which Lynn Lee knows really well, I'm sure. It's called Thor's Well. And a friend of mine took this photograph of it that I thought was just kind of expresses the glory of the earth and God's creation. So that's why we put it on the cover. There's a couple of places in here where I'll have a QR code. And if you want to get a link directly off the PowerPoint, you can take it with your phone on the screen and it'll go right to the link. I use this more in presentations with large groups where there's an audience looking at a screen instead of, individuals looking at your computer, but it'll work on your computer as well. It's just kind of a shortcut instead of writing out an entire URL. Okay, so as an overview here, this is the basic discoveries in the book. I'll just list them and then we'll explain it. These detailed new discoveries explain how Joseph Smith translated the plates using his own language, how the Book of Mormon fits directly within Christian tradition and fulfills the hopes and dreams of well-known Christian authors and ministers, and how the Book of Mormon is God's gift to the entire world. So that's the overview. I like to start off with just a brief discussion of the psychology of belief. And that is that we're all content with our current beliefs or we change them. We don't like having other people trying to change our minds, right? We resist that, but we do enjoy learning new things, as we've been doing every week on Paul's broadcast here. So there's a difference between persuasion and information, and I'm focused on information. I don't expect or want anybody to agree with anything I say. I just want to share the information and you all decide what you think of it and how you can use it. There's another quotation here by Russell Nelson that I've kind of adopted as my motto. And he said that I know that good inspiration is based upon good information. And the good information part is sometimes overlooked. And I just try to constantly find good sources of material and provide as many references as I can in these books, and try to show people how to do their own research so they can get good information, so they make good decisions and the Lord can guide them using that good information. All right, so why does the origin of the Book of Mormon matter? That's a long question, I guess we could ask, but I say it matters. The reason is because it matters to people all around the world, and the Book of Mormon is the possession of all of mankind. And so I think it's exciting and important for us to explain the Book of Mormon to others in the context where they can understand and appreciate it as well, regardless of their religious affiliations. And then here's an example of how the Book of Mormon has been translated in all these languages. As many of you know, last year my wife and I were in China teaching at a university there. Well, this is in 2019, I guess. And we took a trip down to Laos. And I won't go through the whole story, but we ended up finding a small little LDS community who had concerns about church history in the Book of Mormon that we were able to answer their questions. But in the process of the last few years, my wife and I have done a lot of traveling over in Asia. And what I'm marking on this map is places that we visited, but all the red circles are ones where we've attended an LDS church or a temple or something. And that's just to show how widespread the interest in the Book of Mormon is around the world. I mean, this is just in Asia. I could go through South America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. But all these places, there's interest in the Book of Mormon. And I'm just going to give you one quick example. We were in the city of Nanjing. There's 2 universities there. And the other university was, this is in the fall of 2019. The other university was planning to put on a Broadway production. And remember, this is in Nanjing, China. And the Broadway show they selected to produce was, guess what? That's right, the Book of Mormon. They were going to produce the Book of Mormon Broadway show in Nanjing, China. And that's how the interest in the Book of Mormon is worldwide, despite the communist government and everything else. That's what the students wanted to do. And then there's the famous quote from in Wilford Woodruff's journal, where he said, Joseph said, the Book of Mormon was the most correct of any book on earth. This is Wilford Woodruff's actual journal where that quotation came from. So it is a very important, it's the keystone of our religion and our beliefs. Now this table is my summary of the different theories of the Book of Mormon origins, and I'm going to go through it. I know it's kind of small in type, so I'm going to discuss it, but you can take that barcode there, or the QR code in your phone, and it'll take you right to the webpage that has this in all the detail you want. But let me just explain it here. The unshaded boxes that are circled in orange involve divine intervention. The dark shaded boxes with the green around them involve no divine intervention. And the light shaded boxes with the blue around them involve supernatural intervention that may or not originate with the divine depending on one's beliefs. Okay? So at the top it says, all these theories can range from loose, tight, or ironclad control. And we could discuss those phrases if you want, but I think you're all familiar with those. And then on the left, we have a section that Joseph used the plates, and on the right, he did not use the plates. And both of those are broken down into whether there was a curtain or no curtain involved, all right? And you can find historical evidence that arguably supports each of these. So let me just walk through them. The first one on the left says translation. And this is the idea that Joseph studied the characters and copied them and then translated them with the Urim and Thummim, which is what he said he did, that came with the plates. And then he studied it out in his mind and translated using his own lexicon. The second idea with the curtain is that Joseph looked on the plates with the Urim and Thummim and dictated the exact words that appeared on the Urim and Thummim. And then there were times where he was using the plates, but there was no curtain. And that's what I call part of the translation. But Joseph learned the characters engraved on the plates and translated them behind the curtain, but also conducted one or more demonstrations using the seer stone in the hat. And that's the one we've discussed in the past. So I won't go over that. Now, on the side where it says he did not use the plates, if there is a curtain, as people said there was, there's the composition theory, which was that Joseph read the Spalding manuscript, supplemented with Sidney Rigdon's Christian sermons, except when he was conducting demonstrations out in the open. Then the other idea under the curtain is that Joseph and or others composed the text and wrote it out, and he read the manuscript. If there is no curtain involved, then we have what's often referred to as a catalyst theory. And this is a transcription that Joseph read words that appeared on a seer stone and or the spectacles that he placed in a hat, with the plates serving as a catalyst to the process. You may know there's a lot of scholars now that say he never really used the plates, they were covered with the cloth the whole time. Another aspect of it, or another variation of the transcription, is that Joseph read words that he saw in vision as he looked on a seer stone in the hat. There's a book out on that. Another one, a transcription, is that Joseph dictated words as they came into his mind. In other words, that he didn't see them, but they came into his mind and he dictated. And then the other composition idea is that Joseph recited from memory a text he invented or composed. And then the last one on here is Joseph related the text as a story that he invented, but he was using memory clues, mnemonic clues to dictate. So as I've gone through all the variations in the literature about different ways that the Book of Mormon was produced, they all fit in one of these boxes. So recently, for example, Royal Skousen, many of you probably know Royal Skousen, he's kind of the expert on the original manuscript and printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon. Here is his summary after he assessed all the witnesses of the translation. He said, Joseph Smith's claim that he used the Urim and Thummim is only partially true. And what he means by that is Joseph, in his opinion, Joseph only used the Urim and Thummim for the 116 pages. He continued, and Oliver Cowdery's statements that Joseph used the original instrument while he, Oliver, was the scribe appear to be intentionally misleading. So this is a prominent Book of Mormon scholar who's concluding that Joseph and Oliver were not exactly honest when they described the translation. Now I've written a long detailed response to that, which you can see if you use the QR code or the link there. Another example of a scholar who has discussed the translation is Richard Bushman. And here's a quote from his book, Rough Stone Rolling. It says, the plates lay covered on the table while Joseph's head was in a hat looking at the seer stone, which by this time had replaced the interpreters. So that was his conclusion here. And I've written an analysis in response to that as well, which you can see at this link. So let's come back to this idea of why does the origin of the Book of Mormon matter? Here's some of the responses I've gotten when I've kind of done informal polls of people just asking about this. Some people say, I know it's true, so it doesn't matter where it came from. I'm not criticizing any of these, I'm just inventorying the various responses. Other people say the words in the book are the evidence of its divine origin. Some say, could any man have written this book? Emma said words to the effect that Joseph could not dictate a coherent letter, let alone a book like the Book of Mormon, although that's a bizarre statement because he did dictate it. So I don't think it was either recorded accurately or she wasn't exactly sure what she meant by that. Another response is it's an obvious forgery, plagiarism, composition, etc. It's a memorized performance based upon mnemonic clues. It's pure revelation. Joseph and Oliver said he translated it, but everyone else said he read words off a stone or spectacles in a hat, which means either Joseph and Oliver were misleading or lying, as Royal Skousen says, or everyone else was lying. So just to be clear, I don't accept any of those, but I just wanted to provide that inventory to show you the range of ideas there are about the origin of the Book of Mormon. I like to use this graphic to explain how facts work with filters and our hypotheses. So the first fact is Joseph and Oliver said that Joseph translated the plates with Urim and Thummim. I think we all agree that that's a fact, a historical fact, they said that. But some scholars say they misled people, as we just saw with Royal Skousen. And that leads to the conclusion that it's a revelation and not a translation. That same filter on the facts leads to the conclusions, such as in the CES letter, that the Book of Mormon is a fraud. The other alternative filter is to say Joseph and Oliver told the truth, and that leads to the idea that the Book of Mormon is actually a translation, which resolves the objections from the CES letter and other critics. I'm going to show you briefly how that works. And some of you may not be familiar with the CES letter, but because it's so prevalent today, especially among the youth, most youth who have any affiliation with one of the branches of Mormonism have read the CES letter on the internet. And if you notice, his first list of issues involves the Book of Mormon. He talks about the King James errors, the 17th century italics and all that. And his whole premise is that the Book of Mormon is not a translation. Because as soon as you accept the Book of Mormon as a translation, it resolves every one of these issues. Now, the ones I'm not lining out have to do with archaeology and so on that we've talked about separately. But as far as his objections based on the text are all resolved if Joseph translated. And here's an example. He claims that the Book of Mormon, Joseph plagiarized the Book of Mormon or other sources to write the Book of Mormon. But in his own criticism, he uses this phrase, a purported ancient text, which arises in other sources as well. So according to his theory, he plagiarized everybody else as well. And it's just a logical fallacy to say that Joseph plagiarized other material to produce the Book of Mormon. The reason is that these words and phrases are common enough that you can find them everywhere. It's called parallelomania. And they exist because we have a common language. If they didn't exist, we wouldn't have a common language. So the plagiarism is just kind of a logical fallacy. But anyway, the other issues in here are all resolved once you accept the Book of Mormon as a translation. So one other aspect of this is there's these three theories of translation. And that is that assuming Joseph actually translated it, there's a literalist equivalence, which means it closely adheres to the vocabulary and structure of the source language. A functional equivalence, which means it adheres to the structure, but it's flexible with vocabulary. And conceptual equivalence, which means it preserves the meaning without regard to specific grammatical structure or vocabulary. That's a lot of talk, but it's just three different ways that books can be translated. And we can find examples of these in the text. So here's my list of the evidence that Joseph actually translated the plates, not that he read the words off a stone in a hat or in a vision. First off, he said he did. Second, Oliver Cowdery said he did. Third is that any evidence of composition is also evidence of translation. So people who say, well, Joseph composed it are just proving that he translated it because the translator uses the same words that they would use in translating as they would in composition. And finally, the text is from Joseph's lexicon, or what I call his mental language bank. And that's a very key point because there have been some scholars that said that Joseph was so ignorant that the vocabulary in the Book of Mormon had to come from the stone and the hat. He didn't know those words of that vocabulary, so it had to be. But what I'm showing is that the non-biblical language in the Book of Mormon all came from Joseph's environment, so it was part of his lexicon. Just briefly, this is a description of how we learn and use language. We typically learn from our parents and family, our friends in society, books, newspapers. Today, we would learn from the internet. Every time we learn a word or a phrase, it goes into our mind, our mental language bank. And then, so here's the sources, words, phrases, and syntax. Then there's the processing that takes place in our mind, and then the outputs, our speech and our writing. And so we do this with chunks of language. Paul's little brand new great grandson, is that right? So as he grows up, he's going to learn language in chunks, and you'll observe that he'll start speaking phrases. And so we all do that. We just don't remember that we did it. But here's a technical definition of chunks. But so if Joseph translated the Book of Mormon, we should expect to find these chunks of language that he would have learned as he grew up. And so this is, again, Joseph's lexicon consisted of biblical terms and phrases, as well as non-biblical terms and phrases. And it's the non-biblical terms and phrases that we're going to focus on the most. All right, that's kind of the introduction. Now here's a chart that shows the word counts in the scriptures. And you can see on the top line where it has the Old Testament, there's over 600,000 words in total. There's only about 12,000 distinct words. And so one word can be used, several hundred times. And then you can see in the rest of these that the Old Testament has the most unique words. And the Book of Mormon has about the same number of individual words as the New Testament, but it has much higher word count because it repeats those words more often. So that's one data point. The next is, this one breaks it out a little bit more with the total words and the number of separate words. And I won't go through this whole table because you can all access this PowerPoint later. But the point here is that there's certain separate words in the Bible. Many of those are in the Book of Mormon, but many in the Book of Mormon are not in the Bible. That's a key point, the non-biblical words. So in order to break this out, I made a spreadsheet. And I took all the words in the Bible, all those 12 or 13,000 of them, in the first column. And if you look at that, the first one says 8,133. That's the number of times the word a appears in the King James Version. And then if you go over under the Book of Mormon, it says 2,180. That's the number of times the word a appears in the Book of Mormon. And then I put all scriptures, which I use the LDS Doctrine and Covenants from Pearl of Great Price in here because that originated with Joseph as well. And the word a appears 11,732 times in all the scriptures combined. So do you see how I broke that out? If you have questions, you can interrupt anytime. But so then I was interested particularly in words that are in the Book of Mormon, but not in the Bible. And those show up on here as red. And I won't, this is just one page for my spreadsheet. If you're interested, I could show you the whole spreadsheet, but it has like 13,000 lines in it, right? And so I summarized the list of non-biblical Book of Mormon words, and there's around 750 of them here that are significant. And this is just words right now. I started with words.
Jonathan,
Yeah.
I've never heard of the hat and the stone. Can you give me a little information on that?
Yeah, sure. That's the idea that like David Whitmer and Emma and several others said that they were present when Joseph dictated the Book of Mormon, and he took his seer stone and put it in a hat and then covered his face with the hat and read the words that were on the stone. That's what they claimed.
Thank you.
Okay. And I summarize that by just saying stone in the hat, but it's actually, there's some of the accounts say he put spectacles in the hat, which probably wasn't the Urim and Thummim because he had been commanded not to show the Urim and Thummim to anybody, right? But that's the idea that the plates, and they also said the plates were just on the table covered up, that he wasn't even referring to them. Okay, so this list of 750 non-biblical words was where I started, because my theory was that if Joseph actually translated the plates, every word that appears in the Book of Mormon had to come from his own lexicon, right? The Lord inspired him on what to say and how to say it, but the language was his. And so I started going through these words this way and doing searches on them with Google searches. And I kept coming across Jonathan Edwards as a source for this terminology. And then you'll see in a minute, I expanded it to phrases, which is more significant than just words. But I thought, well, how did Joseph have time to learn all this vocabulary, right? We're all kind of told that he was unlearned. He didn't go to school. Some people said he was illiterate. So I started rethinking church history, and I came across this interesting account in his journal from November 14th, 1835. He entertained a visitor, and his record of the visit alludes to an aspect of his life that has been largely overlooked. This is what he said. A gentleman called this afternoon by the name of Erastus Holmes. He called to make inquiry about the establishment of the Church of the Latter-day Saints and to be instructed more perfectly in our doctrine, etc. So let me ask this question. What would you think Joseph would tell this guest when the guest asked about the establishment of the church? Where would Joseph start with that? Where would he start his story? Any ideas?
His birth.
His birth, maybe. Okay.
I would start with the
Usually
Book of
when I
Mormon.
ask this, yeah,
The
with
Book of Mormon.
with the Book of Mormon. Some say with the first vision.
Grove.
Okay,
I
so
would say probably teachings of Christ.
okay, that could be too. But when he asked about the establishment of the church, so it's really a historical question, right? Tell me how you established this church and how did it all start? When I've asked groups about this, they usually will tell me, well, he probably started with the first vision or with the Book of Mormon, one of the two. But he didn't. He said, I commenced and gave him a brief relation of my experience while in my juvenile years, say from age 6, or from 6 years old, up to the time I received the first visitation of angels, which was when I was about 14, and also the visitations I received afterwards concerning the Book of Mormon, and a short account of the rise and progress of the church up to this date. So when I saw that, I thought, well, you know, we all know what happened when he was about 6, right? He had his leg surgery. And I thought, why would he start there when he was reciting the history of the organization of the church? So I looked into this surgery a little bit. This is a segment from the African book. I guess I don't know if I've talked about that, but I've produced a illustrated church history that talks about the origins of the Book of Mormon and so on from an African perspective, as an African artist who drew all these. But here in this case, it was the grandfather telling his son the story of Joseph Smith. And he said, let me tell you about Joseph Smith, who translated the place. When he was about 7 years old, he had a leg surgery that saved his life, and it took him a long time to heal. Here's some more specifics about that. This is, of course, a more detailed, realistic painting, but he had this infection that he called a typhus fever, or he had what he called typhus. He had an infection in his leg. They did these procedures to relieve the pain and swelling, but it kept getting worse. And they said they may have to amputate his leg. So here's the types of instruments they had at the time. You could just imagine going to the doctor and having him present you with these instruments to work on you. But the doctor, Nathan Smith, was the only physician capable of doing the procedure, and he successfully treated Joseph's leg without having to amputate it. But afterwards, Joseph's family sent him with his uncle Jesse to Salem, Massachusetts, to recover near the coast. Now their family, at least the Smiths, had ancestry in that area around Salem, and they believed that the air along the ocean was more healthy. Jesse was a strict Christian, if you know his story. We don't need to get into it now, but this is how Lucy described it. She said, he now began to recover, and when he was able to travel, he went with his uncle Jesse to Salem for the benefit of his health, hoping that the sea breezes might help him. So now here I'm trying to put together why Joseph started with his age of 6 when he had this leg surgery. He goes to Salem with his religious uncle. And what does a boy do when he can't move? He can't get out of bed. He can't walk around and things. And I figured he probably was reading stuff. And we might think that 7 years old is pretty young to read. But Parley Pratt in his journal said that when he was 7 years old, he was reading the Bible and other religious tracts. Eliza R. Snow said when she was that old, she was memorizing passages from the scriptures. So the Bible was their primary source of learning to read anyway. And the religious tracts of the day were designed to encourage particularly young people to study the Bible. And one of those was a preacher named Samuel Dean, who had given these 4 sermons to young men specifically. And they were published in Salem in multiple editions. So they would have been available to Joseph Smith for sure there. And they were the kind of thing that his uncle would have provided to him. So here's what the actual sermons look like. So I thought, well, let me see if that's something that might have any connection with Joseph Smith. So I started reading his sermons. And in this, I'm just going to show you a couple of examples, but the red words here are only in the LDS scriptures, and the green are in the King James Version and the LDS. So the state of probation, better world, eternal happiness, preach faith and repentance, all of these words and phrases are non-biblical, but they're in the Book of Mormon. So they had to originate somewhere. Here's some more here. The plan of government, our freedom, requisite, and so on. So when I saw this, I thought, well, it seems plausible that these words and phrases entered Joseph's mind when he was in Salem reading this Samuel Dean's sermons for young men. Then for 3 years, even after he went back home to Vermont, he had to be carried or use crutches. And I showed here in our illustrated church history that while the other kids were playing, he was reading books. What else could he do? He couldn't help on the farm even. In fact, his injury was so severe that by the time he went to, they traveled to Palmyra, he was still unable to walk easily. And his mother wrote that, she said, I pursued my journey to Palmyra, but a short time until I discovered that the man who drove the team in which we rode was an unprincipled, unfeeling wretch by the manner in which he handled my goods and money, as well as his treatment to my children, especially Joseph, who was still somewhat lame. This was 3 years later. This child was compelled by MH to travel for miles on foot. So we depict Joseph here using his crutches still. He was still lame by the time he went to Palmyra. As you know, the distance from Sheridan, Vermont to Palmyra is quite extensive, but they walked that way, or much of the way. So now we come to the question, was Joseph literate? And I'm just going to show you some examples here. He was unable to work fully on the farm, so he had plenty of time to read. And here's what he said in his own history, his 1832 history. He said, at about the age of 12 years, and this, by the way, this is in his own handwriting, and the diagram here, or the illustration, is from the Joseph Smith papers, but it's Joseph's own handwriting that he wrote this. At about the age of 12 years, my mind became seriously impressed with regard to the all-important concerns for the welfare of my immortal soul, which led me to searching the scriptures, believing as I was taught that they contain the word of God. So here he was searching the scriptures at about the age of 12, for sure. He went on to say, thus applying myself to them, and my intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations led me to marvel exceedingly, for I discovered that they did not adorn their profession, and so on. That phrase, intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations, as I looked into that, most scholars, at least that I've seen, have concluded he was referring to an intimate acquaintance with Christian ministers in the area. But he said another time that he didn't associate with them. Even after, 3 years later, after he had his first vision, he talked about one Methodist minister who rejected what he said. But when he was 12 years old, there's no evidence that he had even an acquaintance with ministers from different denominations, let alone an intimate acquaintance. So I looked at that and I thought, well, he could have an intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations by reading their literature, their religious tracts, their sermons, and various books that were widely available. He went on to say that from the age of 12 years to 15, I pondered many things in my heart concerning the situation of the world and so on. But again, this is from age 12 to 15. Then he said, and by searching the scriptures, I found that mankind did not come unto the Lord, but they had apostatized from the true and living faith, and so on. So he's just in this short part of his history, he's emphasized 3 times that he searched the scriptures. He said, I felt to mourn for my own sins and for the sins of the world, for I learned in the scriptures that God was the same yesterday, today, and forever. So again, he learned from the scriptures. Now, by the way, since we're talking about the 1832 history, I annotated it in the appendix in this book, and I showed possible sources of the terminology Joseph used in his history. And here's a few I'll just highlight. One here was conferred upon. It's not a biblical phrase, but it does appear in the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, and in Jonathan Edwards, who uses that exact phrase. Another one is spared no pains. That's not in the scriptures. It's not in any of the scriptures, but it is in Jonathan Edwards. And the examples here are the clergy of France has spared no pains, persons they considered spared no pains nor costs, and so on. I showed a couple of examples here. Another one was Joseph said that his parents spared no pains to instruct him in the Christian religion. Of course, that's not a biblical phrase, but Jonathan Edwards talked about a Stockbridge Indian who had been instructed in the Christian religion. So there's precedent for that phrase. And then another one is indigent circumstances, which is not in the scriptures, but it is in Jonathan Edwards. So as I've annotated Joseph's own history, it's most of the language in there is either biblical or Jonathan Edwards. Okay, next. People say, well, his mother said he never read the Bible through and he only perused books, he didn't study them. But here's something that she said in her history. She said, Joseph refused from the first to attend the meeting with us. He would say, Mother, I do not wish to prevent you from going to meeting or joining any church you like or any of the family who desire the like. Only do not ask me to do so, for I do not wish to go. But I will take my Bible and go out into the woods and learn more in 2 hours than you could if you were going to meeting for 2 years. Now that sounds like Joseph Smith, but it's just another example of how much he was studying the Bible. And this was all before he ever got the plates. So he was very very familiar with the Bible and Christian terminology and theology and so on. So that's just his history here. Now, another thing that's quite interesting in doing this was to find the same patterns and the same phrases and words in his other revelations and writings. And I'm going to show you just a few from the Doctrine and Covenants that kind of, that I think of now as the Lord talking to Joseph Smith, but telling him things he already knew and expressing the way that the Lord prepared Joseph in his life. So here's one where the Lord told Oliver to treasure up these words in thy heart, which was what Joseph did from a young age. Another one, treasure up in your minds continually the words of life. That just described how Joseph Smith approached. He was a seeker, in other words, and this is what he did. Seek not to declare my word, but first seek to obtain my word. Again, that's describing Joseph Smith. Hold your peace, study my word, which hath gone forth among the children of men, which of course was the Bible, and also study my word, which shall come forth, which was the translating of the Book of Mormon. Now, it's interesting also to go through some of the historical collections in Palmyra, where they have this, here's an example from a classroom attendance, and it shows that Joseph was hardly ever attended school, at least at this age. And so he was definitely unlearned in the sense that he didn't go to school. But like his mother said, he said he could learn more with just the Bible in 2 hours out in the woods than he could by going to church and presumably by going to school as well. This is another interesting little sidelight here. It's a document that shows that Joseph was getting credit for some work that he did. I don't need to really go through that in detail, but now there's another source for Joseph's lexicon, and this is from the newspaper, the Palmyra Register. And this particular example talks about the bar of God, which is a Book of Mormon term that's not found in the Bible. Here's an example of the Palmyra Register, and we'll come back to this a little later on. But let me just give you another example, the one that Paul mentioned at the beginning, which is the name of the book, Infinite Goodness. So I use a program that's called Word Cruncher. And I looked up all the references to infinite goodness in the scriptures, and there's only 4 of them in all the scriptures, and they're all in the Book of Mormon. And so I thought, well, here's the scriptures. You can see the phrases. But then I wanted to know if there was a parallel to those in Jonathan Edwards. And first off, Jonathan Edwards used that same phrase 55 times. Here in the Book of Mormon in Mosiah, it says, through the infinite goodness of God, and Jonathan Edwards wrote, through the infinite goodness of God, I felt what I spake, and so on. So he used that exact phrase. And whenever you're doing a literary critique or analysis, similar words aren't that significant. Similar phrases are more significant, and the more words in the phrase, the more significant, because those are those language chunks that I talked about at the beginning. But even when you see many of them, it's even more significant. So here's another one. The Lord in his great infinite goodness, and Edwards wrote, in Christ, infinite greatness and infinite goodness. So he made 2 phrases out of it, but it's the same idea of great infinite goodness. Down here it says, through his infinite goodness and grace, and Edwards wrote about the infinite goodness and grace. So those are just 3 examples. And I actually, in Paul's email, I think he said there were about 100 of these. And in the book, I have about 1,140, and I have more that I didn't have time to put in the book. So it's a substantial body of Jonathan Edwards. I'm going to show you some examples in a minute. But here's the book, The Works of Jonathan Edwards. Now, the next question you might have is, how did Joseph Smith have access to the works of Jonathan Edwards, right? So if you remember when I showed you this Palmyra newspaper, they had a list of books that were on sale in the Palmyra bookstore. And one of them was Edwards' works, 8 volumes. And I hadn't realized that, because when I first got into this research, I didn't know what Edwards' works referred to. I just saw it as a list, but I didn't know what it was. But after I kept finding Jonathan Edwards' phrases in the Book of Mormon, I looked back at this list and I said, well, wait a minute, I wonder if there was an 8-volume set of Jonathan Edwards' works that this was referring to. And sure enough, Jonathan Edwards' works, the first compilation was published in 1808, and it was 8 volumes. So it fits this. And so I was, I like to really do my due diligence and check stuff. So I went on eBay and I bought a set of 1808 Jonathan Edwards books. Here's one of them right here, right, to show you. So this is a 200 and something year old book, but this 8-volume set was on sale in the Palmyra bookstore. And what's interesting about that is there was a guy named Orsamus Turner who worked in the bookstore. And when he was writing his memory of growing up, he wrote a little bit about Joseph Smith. And he said Joseph was an inquisitive, meddling lingerer at the bookstore. And he annoyed him so much that they would get an ink dauber that they would put on the plates to create the newspaper. And they would blacken Joseph's face with it just to get him out of the store. But that phrase, meddling lingerer, a meddling inquisitive lingerer, describes his impression of Joseph Smith, that he was always hanging out in the bookstore lingering, which fits with the idea that Joseph had access to the books that were in the bookstore. So here's one of the things that really struck me. It's in this volume here. We're all familiar with King Benjamin saying the natural man is an enemy to God. That's not a biblical phrase. You can find natural man in one area, enemy of God in another area, but they're different ideas and not combined. Natural enemy to God is right here in the Book of Mormon. And Jonathan Edwards, it turns out, wrote an entire sermon called Men Are Naturally God's Enemies. And his sermons tended to be, 10, 20, 30 pages long. And so as he goes through this analysis here, he uses this same phrase about the natural man as an enemy to God several times, both plural and singular. But here the doctrine he's expounding on is natural men are God's enemies. And what is really fascinating to me is that King Benjamin never really explained what a natural man was or what an enemy to God was. I've seen lots of authors speculate on what he meant and say, well, he was referring to this or that, but King Benjamin didn't explain it. Just like the Book of Mormon doesn't explain the law of Moses, it doesn't explain how a natural man is an enemy to God. but it's an allusion, I think now, to Jonathan Edwards, because Jonathan Edwards in this well-known sermon explained in much detail how the natural man is an enemy to God. It's really awesome. In fact, I put most of that sermon in the book so people could see for themselves. Now let's put this all in context. I'll try to hurry this up. We all know the idea of the prologue and the restoration. There would be an apostasy, then a restoration. Joseph Smith would be prepared. I'm just going to skip through these. These are kind of well known. This is something Brigham Young said that also explains this. He says, before I heard the gospel, I searched diligently to know and understand whatever could be learned among the sectarians respecting God and the plan of salvation. It was so with the majority of the Latter-day Saints. So people who responded to the gospel message had been studying what other Christians were teaching, as well as the Bible, of course. He said, the Christian world are deficient in these matters. Many of them who believe the Bible was true have felt this. Martin Luther, John Calvin, John Wesley, other great reformers and revivalists have felt this. They've had the spirit of conviction upon them that God was going to reveal something or other to his creatures. So John Wycliffe, Martin Luther, John Calvin, John Wesley, all of these were precursors to the restoration. And finally, Jonathan Edwards. Here's some of the influences on Joseph Smith that we don't have time to go through in detail, but of course his mother and his family, Jonathan Edwards, King James Bible, Palmyra Register, the Late War, other books that Joseph would have read and been familiar with. So let me just give you a little background on Jonathan Edwards, and then we'll look at the specific examples. This is, I visited some of the sites associated with Jonathan Edwards. This was a marker in Enfield, Connecticut, where he gave his famous sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God that he's been noted for. This is one of the churches where he preached, South Windsor, Connecticut. This is his birthplace. You can see that he was born in 1703. His grandson was Aaron Burr, which is a little bit of a claim to fame, I guess, that he has. But again, as I pointed out, that the Palmyra Register was advertising the sale of his works. So now let me just show you a few examples of things Edwards wrote that you can see how, well, when you read these, think of yourself as a young Joseph Smith reading this, okay? And see what kind of an impression it would have made on you. This one's kind of long, but let me just point out at the bottom, he's talking about the fulfillment of the prophecies, but he says the beginning of the great work of God must be near. Remember, he was writing in the 1700s. And there are many things that make it probable that this work will begin in America. He said, it's exceeding manifest that this chapter, Isaiah, is a prophecy of the prosperity of the church in its most glorious state on earth in the latter days. And I can't think that anything else can be here intended but America, by the phrase, the isles that are far off. This prophecy, therefore, seems plainly to point out America as the first fruits of that glorious day. So young Joseph Smith, being prepared to be the prophet of the restoration, is reading Jonathan Edwards talking about the glorious state of the church in the latter days and that America was where it would originate. He said here, the new world, meaning America, is probably now discovered that the new and most glorious state of God's church on earth might commence there. That God might in it begin a new world in a spiritual respect when he creates the new heavens and new earth. And then I put a note in here that commence is one of these non-biblical words that Joseph used in the Book of Mormon 17 times and 3 times in the Doctrine and Covenants, such as the work of the Father shall commence, my work shall commence, the Lord shall commence his work, and so on. But that's similar to, well, it's the same word Edwards used, but it's in the same context as well. Then he said, Edwards discussed Daniel's prophecy. And he said, thus it is meet that the last kingdom which shall take place on earth should be the kingdom of God's own Son and heir, whose right it is to reign and rule. Now, that's significant because many times in church history, church leaders would describe Daniel's prophecy as being fulfilled by the restoration, which is how Jonathan Edwards described it. He said, he talked about for a long time, the cause of truth, the righteous cause should finally prevail and God's holy people should at last inherit the earth. which is also a similar terminology. The future promised advancement of the kingdom of Christ is an event unspeakably happy and glorious. The vast increase of knowledge and understanding. All of these are concepts that we're familiar with in the restoration. He talked about how the temple of God in heaven would be open. This one, he says, he talked about a time where religion and true Christianity shall in every respect be uppermost in the world, wherein God will cause his church to arise and shake herself from the dust and put on her beautiful garments and sit down on a throne, which again sounds like what Moroni wrote in the last chapter when he said, awake and arise from the dust, O Jerusalem, put on thy beautiful garments, and so on. So I'm giving you just a few examples here. In fact, let me just skip through some of these because we're running out of time, I think. But one of these is, such being the state of things in this future promised glorious day of the church's prosperity. And he, of course, Nephi used that same terminology about the glorious day. The prosperity of the church is a non-biblical phrase that's in the Book of Mormon in a couple of places. Joseph Smith himself talked about the glorious day, again, a non-biblical phrase. Here's one that I really liked in Mormon. He says, upon the place of Nephi, I did make a full account of all the wickedness and abominations. Again, everything in red here is a non-biblical phrase. I did forbear to make a full account of their wickedness and abominations, for behold, a continual scene of wickedness and abominations has been before me. So I looked that up. The phrase wickedness and abominations is a non-biblical phrase. It's very common in the Book of Mormon, 35 times, twice in the Doctrine and Covenants, which you can see here. Edwards used that exact phrase, a scene of wickedness and abominations. So that's another relatively long phrase, a unique combination of words. It's non-biblical, but it is in the Book of Mormon. So in summary, the Book of Mormon contains hundreds of these non-biblical terms, phrases, and concepts. And the same is true of the Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, and Joseph Smith's personal writings. And as a sanity check, I assessed the writings of Oliver Cowdery and Sidney Rigdon and some others, and they don't have this connection with Jonathan Edwards at all. And in fact, the only one that did that I could find was Joseph Smith. And then, so it's been really interesting because I can look at the scriptures and see Jonathan Edwards, and I can look at Jonathan Edwards' writings and see the Latter-day Scriptures. There's several instances where the Book of Mormon will paraphrase a passage from the Bible, and the scholars, Royal Scouts and other scholars will say, well, this was Joseph Smith kind of modifying the biblical language, but those same paraphrases are in the works of Jonathan Edwards. And sometimes Edwards took it upon himself to retranslate passages in the Bible. Of course, he was fluent in Greek and Latin and Hebrew. And so he said, well, this passage reads this, but it would be better if it read this way. And his retranslation of it appears in the Book of Mormon. Other times he would paraphrase scriptures and not quote them exactly, and those appear in the Book of Mormon. And so it's really an exciting thing. I'm at the point now where, because I've gone through this elaborate analysis, where I can identify, of course, the biblical language, the Edwards language, and then the language that's in between, where it's biblical language that's modified, but Edwards had modified it exactly the same way. So I think it's awesome evidence that Joseph Smith actually translated the plates, and he had the vocabulary, the syntax, and the understanding of Christian principles that he had been prepared by the Lord to do so that he could translate the plates that way. So just to summarize here, to end up, the Book of Mormon is a possession of mankind, and it's squarely within Christian tradition. And I'm excited about this because as I've been speaking to other Christians about this, they've started to see that maybe the Book of Mormon does fit within their tradition. And it was anticipated by, of all people, Jonathan Edwards. It's really exciting. And it's, in a way, I'm a little frustrated that so many of us have been using the Book of Mormon as a conversion tool. Like, believe the Book of Mormon and join my church, instead of saying, here's a book that testifies of Christ that can help you in your life, regardless of what church you belong to. It comes out of Christian tradition, and they can see it. When I show them this Jonathan Edwards link, they engage it, and they enjoy it, and they appreciate it, and they adopt it even. It's really awesome. So I guess, I mean, I could go on, but I've talked long enough. It looks like it's 8 o'clock. I meant to have more time for questions, but Paul, I guess we can open it up for questions now.
Great. Well, I hope the rest of you can appreciate that when I sent the email, I'd only read the first little bit. And I over 100 of them. Now I read the whole book and I have pages of questions and notes that I'm going to yield to the rest of you because I happen to have his email and he's been extremely good to respond to ask questions previously. So the floor is open for questions.